This lens, man. The Sony 50mm G Master is one of the most unique Sony lenses available. It features the widest aperture of any Sony lens, while still being sharp and having superb autofocus. The 50mm G Master costs $2,000, is really heavy at 1.7 pounds. It measures 4.3 by 3.4 inches. It has a 72mm front thread and 11 aperture blades. The minimum focusing distance is 1.3 feet or 15.5 inches. It's a little far away in my opinion. If you like doing a lot of close-up shots, this isn't advertised as a macro lens, but I find myself filming a lot of details with this lens, so a minimum focusing distance that was a little closer would be really great. The build quality of the G Master lens is exactly like you would expect with G Master lenses. It has dust and moisture sealing on the back, a focus switch, an aperture ring that can be clicked or declicked, focus ring, and 2 customizable buttons. My favorite part of this lens, aside from the very wide aperture, is the autofocus. This lens has 4 of Sony's XD linear motors powering its autofocus, and it has some of the most accurate autofocus I've ever seen, even wide open at f1.2. I've been using this lens with my Sony a7S III and my a7 IV, and the eye autofocus has been able to lock onto subjects that are moving around the frame with ease. I've loved using eye autofocus and moving the camera around to create some parallax with my shots, something that was pretty difficult to do with a shallower depth of field on other prime lenses without autofocus jumping around, or it was difficult to use manual focus while moving at such a shallow depth of field and keeping the subject razor sharp. The linear XD motors do a great job, but the fact that there's 4 of them in here is really beneficial, especially when we're talking about video. Sharpness on the 50mm 1.2 is great. I was nervous that this was going to be a little soft wide open because of that wide aperture at 1.2. This is something that makes this lens so unique. Typically large apertures have issues with sharpness and contrast, but the 1.2 is doing a great job with this. Wide open, the lens is sharpest in the center while losing a little bit of sharpness around the edges of the frame, but it's still very usable in my opinion. And by f2, the corner sharpness is as sharp as the center. When it comes to flares on this lens, it handles the flares pretty well. It's a G Master lens, so it handles like other G Master lenses do. It does a great job at minimizing the distraction of those flares. There's a slight amount of chromatic aberration with this lens as well, but I've only noticed it in the most extreme circumstances. Very bright backgrounds and dark silhouetted subjects have some color fringing, but not nearly as much as other lenses. It's very well controlled and it's only distracting if you're pixel peeping in my opinion. The bokeh on the 1.2 is circular in the center and it's more distorted towards the edges. The quality of the bokeh is very clean, but there's little to no distracting texture on it. On cheaper lenses, the bokeh will have a little bit more texture and be distorted, but with those 11 aperture blades, there's a nice circular bokeh in the center, and the only distortion is moving towards the edges where you get that cat eye shape. The 50mm 1.2 does have some focusing breathing problems. If you have a newer Sony camera, it is compatible with that focus breathing compensation, however. There is a slight crop, but with that slight crop, the problem is removed. If your camera doesn't have that feature and you do a lot of rack focusing between objects close and far away, this could be distracting. I wish the focus breathing wasn't as much of an issue on this lens as it is, considering its price tag, but if you have a newer camera that's compatible with that focus breathing compensation, this isn't as big of a deal. The 50mm 1.2 does not have any kind of stabilization optically, but you can take advantage of your active stabilization if your Sony body has that. The 50mm 1.2 is one of those lenses that has such a unique look by being so sharp wide open and having fantastic autofocus thanks to those 4 XD linear motors that the image coming out of this is truly unique. Pairing this with a modern Sony body will give you some great results, especially if you're taking advantage of the focus breathing compensation and the active stabilization. The 50mm focal length has been one that I've passed up a lot on the past because it's a little too tight to just walk around every day with, but it doesn't show those fine details like a telephoto lens would. It's somewhere in the middle and the focal length has always felt a little boring to me, but the performance of the 1.2 and its ability to turn boring shots into something very interesting, separating the subject from the background when the subject is this close away from another object, is something that is truly unique to this lens. Even if you're getting this lens to shoot at only f2 and above, the corner sharpness, chromatic aberration, and flare control all outperform just about every other 50mm full-frame Sony lens, as it should given its price tag. That's really the only drawback of the 50mm 1.2 is that humongous price tag that makes it kind of inaccessible for a lot of photographers and videographers to justify owning. But if you can justify the price tag, it is a fantastic lens that will deliver great results. Check out what I learned comparing the most expensive 50mm Sony lens to the least expensive 50mm Sony lens, or this video about rigging up your Sony camera. Thank you guys for sticking around to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.